And so I feel like I'm finally getting the hang of it. But it's so good to have everybody here today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to spend some time with us. My name is EJ White. I am the head of growth over here at Beehive. We also, off camera, have Tony, who is my right hand man over here, running all of our lifecycle marketing. So all the communications you'll get, after this um, webinar and everything. So, everybody give him a quick round of applause, or save it for the end once you actually see how this goes if you're new. If you're rejoining us from a past webinar, we're so happy to have you back joining us. We promise to bring all the value today and leave you with some great actionable next steps. Amazing. So without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen so we can jump into the deck. While I'm doing that, if you're in the chat, please feel free to sound off with where you are watching from today. Would love to see where everyone is at and calling in from. But yeah, here we go. We got the deck pulled up. We got some Toronto, Vegas, Austin, Nashville, amazing Maryland. Shout out from Maryland originally. I'm calling in from Brooklyn today. Just moved here a couple months ago. We got Guatemala, LA. We truly are worldwide. This is great. This is really exciting. It's kind of crazy that we can be doing this and we get the chance to talk to people from everywhere. ATL, love it. My brother's at Georgia Tech. He's a sophomore there. He loves it. I've never been to Atlanta. It's on my list. I need to go visit him. Johannesburg, another place on my list. Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Continue to drop those in the chat and we will get started. So what we're going to cover today, and sorry, one sec, we'll go back. We are going to have a special guest join us. Francis Zyrer, the editor of Creator Spotlight, will be joining us at around 12:15. He'll be hopping in. He had a prior engagement, so he will be joining us. But the deck that I've created had input from our illustrious CEO, Tyler Dank, who's an excellent writer, one of the best that I've ever met, writes the weekly Big Desk Energy newsletter. And then Francis, of course, does the weekly interviews and newsletter for Creator Spotlight. So, these findings have also been taken across, different resources like My First Million, various books that, we've read on the subjects to really provide the most amount of value. So this should be really quite distilled from expert information, expert knowledge to get you off on the right foot. So to get started, a couple housekeeping things. We have the agenda here on the left, so you can see what we'll be covering. On the right side, we have a link that I believe Tony will drop in the chat, but you can just type it in as well if you see it there for questions. We would appreciate that you save questions for the Q&A at the end. We promise to save time to go over questions that we don't answer in the course of the chat, but this helps us keep the conversation on the rails and nice and tight and efficient. So if you do have questions, we want to hear them. We want to see them. If you can drop those in that Google form, that'd be perfect. And then we're going to do a little group activity to start off. There's invariably always at least one person, usually more than one, that comes into the chat during the presentation and asks, is the recording going to be provided afterwards? Or, is there some place where we can download the recording, watch later? The answer is absolutely yes. We will be cleaning up the recording and uploading it to the blog. And so if you do want to see the recording afterwards, you want to go back, that will be made available as well as with the deck. We'll provide the deck for download. We'll also, any resources that we list, any websites that we talk about, we'll also include those links. The post will have timestamps of everything that we cover. So the group activity is when that person invariably comes to the chat and asks, is this going to be recorded? We're all going to jump in and we're all going to say, absolutely, yes, it's going to be recorded, because there's always at least one. And last night when I did this, I gave them the same spiel and no one jumped in. They left it up to me to answer the person that yes, it'll be recorded. So I'm counting on you to, everybody wherever you are, whether in Sao Paulo or LA, when that person jumps in, please help us out by letting them know that yes, the recording will be provided and all resources shared. So with that covered, we're going to jump in. Our agenda today is packed. We have sections here for understanding your audience, basically getting started from step one, developing that consistent voice and tone, mastering the hook, structuring your content, telling stories, and finally, once you've put all that together and you're ready to press go, before you press publish, you're going to want to go through and really edit down and pare down for clarity and impact. After that, we'll have the Q&A, and when we finish up, you'll be on your way to being a better writer. You'll be fully capable of creating the next great internet content. So with that covered, we are going to jump right in. First step, I say this if you've been to any of the other webinars, we generally have kind of a laying the groundwork type slide. Most of the other webinars have been more strictly around newsletters. And so this webinar is going to take a little bit of a different format where I don't have that laying the groundwork phase, because it's meant about being, this is meant for becoming a better writer generally. You don't have to necessarily have a newsletter to want to be a better writer or to work towards being a better writer. And so there's no laying the groundwork kind of slide here that covers those basics, because we wanted it to be a little bit more agnostic. But just like with that laying the groundwork slide, the key to here is to understand your audience. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. And this is your chance, chat, to go and do exactly what I told you to do. But Lewis, yes, the deck will be available for download offline with viewer permissions. We won't provide edit permissions, but you will be able to view it as a PDF. So with that distraction, this is why I give that prompt, because there's a little bit of a distraction that comes sometimes. So first step, whether you're running a newsletter, whether you just want to start writing, is to understand your audience. And when we say this, there's, the approach of basically, who are you writing to? When you're writing a newsletter, when you're writing an essay, when you're writing a book, who is the reader that you are trying to reach? And the more you can focus and get really drilled in on who that specific person is, the better your writing is going to be, the more tight it's going to be, the more concise it's going to be, and the more impactful it's going to be. So when we say, who is that reader? There's an exercise in marketing where you kind of come up with a user persona. It's a very similar process, but when you visualize the person you're writing to, you really want to kind of create a whole person around them. What do they do for work? What do they do for fun? What challenges do they face in their daily life? What type of family situation do they have? Do they live in the city or do they live in the country? What does their daily routine look like? What is distracting them? What's vying for their attention? Do they have kids that, this is a moment, if you're writing a newsletter, whether they can escape, or, they're, working, very stressful, high finance job where it's like the newsletter needs to be super tight because they're super busy. All of these things, there's really not really a limit to how specific you can get with who this person you're writing to is. There's an excellent podcast by the My First Million folks. We reference this all the time. Sean Puri and the guy from HubSpot, Sam Parr, the guy from The Hustle. They talk about, basically having this audience of one being way more useful than trying to keep in mind like 10 different people that you're trying to write to. Because as soon as you start to write to kind of a group or, multiple different personas, the writing is going to become less impactful. Your points are going to become less salient. And overall, it's going to be, it's not going to achieve the goals in the way that you want. So we really recommend embracing the audience of one approach, really creating that detailed persona for your ideal reader, whether you're doing that, writing it down. We definitely recommend writing it down so you have kind of the persona on paper. It's useful also if you have a team that you're writing with, so that everybody's working from the same sheet of music, so to speak. And then, as far as that goes, then you can take those very specific attributes of your user persona and then tailor your content to address their specific needs. The reason why we usually include this as the kind of laying the groundwork part of the newsletter webinars is that when you understand who this reader is, everything else becomes so much easier. Who your advertisers might be, what is going to interest your readers, the types of polls that you might ask them, the frequency that you're going to send to them, everything about it, what you could offer for them as a paid subscription. All of these things become infinitely easier when you have that very kind of audience of one, individual in mind approach. And that's to say, once you start doing that, that's when you're going to start to have that content market fit where you're going to see some more organic growth, when you really nail the needs and kind of attributes of that of that reader with your writing. With that said, Francis, I know you can just jump right in here. This is something we've talked a ton about, so you can already see kind of what we're going down, even though And first of all, everybody give Francis a big welcome.
What's up?
Thank you for joining us and taking some time out of your busy day. And also for dealing with us because we actually forgot to invite him until last minute. So it wasn't
I'm
so
always
much,
ready.
he had prior engagements. It's that we literally imposed on him 2 hours ago saying, hey, you're joining, right? Um, but that is to say, Francis, can you give us a quick introduction? Tell us what you do with Creator Spotlight, and then maybe provide some fire insights
Yeah.
based on this first slide.
Hello. I'm Francis Zier. I write Creator Spotlight every Friday. It's a podcast and a newsletter. I interview creators, newsletter writers, podcasters, TikTokers, YouTube strategists, and
I love
try
that.
to find out
One
what they do.
sec.
Um, yeah. Okay. Understanding your
For
audience.
for whatever
Oh,
reason,
go
real
ahead.
quick, Francis, I'm sorry to cut in and break you up. I was having the same problem with Tony, and I figured we would solve this. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me.
Real quick in the chat, can everybody else hear him? I assume that Tony can hear.
Oh, they can hear me.
So it's definitely something on my end. All right, I'm taking my
Okay.
AirPods out.
Okay, so one thing I'll say about understanding your audience, I think first thing that comes to mind here is like whether you're like kind of more of a columnist type newsletter writer or like a publication type newsletter writer. Whereas like I write with my voice, right? Like in Creator Spotlight. But then something like, a big newsletter like Semaphore is obviously like that's more of a journalist newsletter. So I think if it's just you as like a columnist writer, you kind of have more freedom. But if it is more of a like multiple writers, you really have to like impose that editorial voice. But yeah, I don't know. It's like you don't have to overcomplicate it, but it's definitely something you want to spend a lot of time researching beforehand just to give you like would this person be interested in this thing? This is most important to me when I'm editing, honestly, because I'll write like a 3,000 word draft for Creator Spotlight and then I have to cut it down. So I'm like, okay, this I enjoyed writing this part and I think it's a fun part to read, but like will my audience of like people who want to learn about other creators and their process and their business, will they think this is interesting? And if not, then you cut it. So I think it's really, really useful for just what do I not write about.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Um, Also, just to close the loop, I'm a doofus. My tab was muted, so sorry about that, everyone, for distracting everything. Thank you so much, Francis. I really appreciate that insight. I heard the last bit of it, and I know that everything that came before that was incredible.
You flatter me.
Because I've heard you do these talks before. So, um, are we good to move on? Next slide. Cool. Awesome. So the next step, again, this is some recommendations that come from Sean Purry, Sam Parr from that My First Million, like Becoming a Better Writer podcast primarily, although these are great recommendations generally. But they're really salient in terms of kind of how to frame kind of that foundational work. So you understand your writer, and we have a progression here. So we're starting with like the foundational aspects and then moving more towards actually putting the pen to paper or the fingers to keys, so to speak. So in that way, we have our audience, we know who we're trying to write to, and now we're going to kind of take the next step in that process, and that's understanding what is the objective, what do we hope to achieve by sitting down and writing a piece of content. And so a great model for kind of taking this next step is starting with the end in mind. What are the key takeaways that you want your writer or your reader to leave with? Like what impact do you want to have to them? Is it to convince them of something? Is it to get them excited about something? What is the one line that if they read your whole piece that you want them to take away remembering, what the piece is about? So Francis is writing Creator Spotlight. He's writing about this, this creator, and maybe they had some sort of unique way in which they grew their newsletter. That might be the one takeaway. It's like, I want to unpack how they use this unique growth hack to grow their newsletter huge. And if the reader walks away just remembering this one piece, then I've been successful. Along with that, so that's kind of the between the ears, what do you want them to remember? But then memories are always, better kind of created and remembered and impactful when you pair an experience with an emotion. And so by starting your writing and identifying an emotion that you want to instill, you can kind of couple this kind of objective takeaway with an emotion. And when you're able to do both of those things, it makes them both much more powerful, and it's going to make your writing resonate and drive the users to take some sort of action much more effectively than if you don't do that and you write in a much more clinical, kind of an emotional way. And so there's generally kind of the big ones. There's, glad, mad, sad, and afraid was what my improv teacher taught me. So afraid being afraid. But glad, mad, sad, afraid, shocked, are kind of some of the big ones. So it's like, do you want, if you're writing, you're an activist and you have a newsletter, about climate change, there's some of those. Do you want your writer to really feel, upset and feel fired up about some sort of injustice? Or if you are morning brew, do you want to just have them coming away in a better mood and a little bit happier because they've, read the witty little, kind of the news in a witty way. So they come away feeling educated, but also kind of uplifted as that emotion. So, understanding what emotion you want to drive and pairing that with your takeaways can be very powerful. And then both of these things culminate and kind of focus on that call to action. So at the end of your writing, at the end, when a user has digested the whole thing, what do you want them to do? Is there something you want them to do? There's a principle in marketing when you're designing, web experiences where it's like you always want the user to be able to take a next step. You never want the user to hit a dead end, because when a user hits a dead end, the options are very, very limited. Either they hit the back button, but they also, they don't know what to do after that because they already came from there, or they're going to bounce. And in either case, you're basically ending the user journey if they hit a dead end. And the same principle applies with some writing. So if they get to the end of your piece and they don't really have that next step, then whatever emotional kind of bond you created or feeling you instilled is really going to almost just evaporate and kind of be a little bit wasted, unless it's like part of the, in service to like a greater kind of journey that they're on, with you. But in that way, clarifying a call to action can then not just extend the user journey, but help you achieve your goals. So it's like if you're that climate, newsletter, you get someone really fired up, you get them feeling like there's this huge injustice. Then at the very end, you put a link where it's like, hey, if you want to help do something about this, sign this petition. That's a very, very effective way to take the writing, create the takeaway, connect it with emotion, and then drive some action from that. And just understanding what you want that to action to be at the beginning will set the scene for how your writing takes shape. And so just like kind of this last point is just taking all three of these things together can be very, very powerful in driving impact with your writing. And so it's very specifically valuable to newsletters because that's what we're trying to do at the end of the day. We're trying to either drive the impact of like them opening the next newsletter or the next edition. We want them to upgrade to a paid subscription. We want them to take some sort of action. We want them to click through one of the links. It depends on what you're writing about, but we typically aren't seeing as many just pure kind of essays, thought pieces of like, hey, you're going to read this, think about it, and just like walk away and just not have any next step. It's certainly the exception proves the rule. But this can be very, very powerful. Francis, I see you nodding your head. I know that you are jiving with all this over there.
Yes. No,
let's hear some stuff.
I got some thoughts. I think, I mean, the headline of this, start with the end in mind. I think it's good to start with that, but I think it's really important also to like not get so hung up on it. Like when you're actually writing, it's kind of the start and the end of the process. You want to know why you're writing a thing, but then you don't want to like let that burden you and like make you question every sentence when you're writing it. At least that's how I write. But then like when you're editing, right, like that's when you really are like cutting down for the end, which is what I was just saying before too. It's like you need those things to guide you and like to be decisive in the edit. I also think like we were saying, like, most newsletters aren't essays and stuff, but I think it's really important to say that like writing, if it's not just like, reporting a very objective list of facts or whatever, it's about processing thoughts too. Like if you're like grappling with an idea, I think it's also like, it's okay to not know the end. It's okay to like have the question you're trying to answer and like, the end being that question, but like allowing yourself to find, like if it's some op-ed, right? Like allowing yourself to find that end. But I also, EJ, I really like what you're saying, where like the call to action can just be to like open the next newsletter, where it's like your goal should just be to make this good enough storytelling that it like convinces people to stay around for the next one.
Absolutely. And of course, all of this advice is really, really dependent on what your content is. It's like if you are a newsletter that's like trying to get somebody to just keep opening day after day, it's going to be a very, very different, endeavor than if you're, again, that like activist, where you're trying to drive to some sort of outside external thing. But yeah, all of these things, if you hear something that resonates, you can take it and run with it. Cool. Next, develop a consistent voice and tone. Now, I'm super excited to hear from Francis on this because he has one of just the most consistent and just like unique tones and voices through his writing that I've ever met. I think Tyler, our CEO, is another one where it's like when I read his newsletter, it's like I can literally hear his voice like in my head when I read it because he writes in a very, very similar way to the way that he talks and speaks. You don't have to do that, but it's like, you know, these are both two people who write in a very, very unique way where it is very engaging and keeps me coming back. So, developing a consistent voice and tone is a way that you can then develop a relationship with your reader on kind of this meta level where they kind of know what to expect from you as a writer. And that consistency can be very comforting. So it's like if you have a very, you know, like sporadic or erratic voice and tone to your newsletter or to your writing, it's going to be much harder for readers to connect with you over time. They might read one and you might resonate with a certain audience because of a certain tone or a certain approach to your voice. And then if you completely change it up in the next piece that you write, you may not basically carry over that initial audience. You may attract a totally different audience. And that kind of very erratic kind of behavior is not going to lead to consistent kind of audience distillation and growth in a way, unless that's like, I mean, again, the exceptions prove the rule here, but it can be much harder to do so in that way. So developing a consistent voice and tone can really drive a deeper emotional connection and understand like what you want that tone to be from the outset or from like a, you know, early testing kind of period, or, you know, maybe you're learning over time because you're brand new to writing. Really paying attention to that can be super valuable. So a lot of times the voice and tone will be related to the personality, so to speak, of your newsletter or the brand of your newsletter. So if you are writing, you know, pure news, if you're, you know, a industry report type newsletter, your voice and tone should be generally, again, exceptions prove the rule, but your tone should be kind of very professional, very clinical. You're providing news in a way that is objective, you know, versus if you're, you know, one of the newsletters that's like kind of pop culture where it's kind of salacious, you know, your voice and tone is going to be a lot different than that, you know, than that kind of buttoned up industry reporting. So in that way, you know, that kind of tone and matching the brand and the personality of your newsletter will then lead you to use certain language that, you know, is going to either, you're going to naturally know that it resonates with your audience, or you can deliberately choose to resonate with your audience. And then again, you know, maintaining that consistency is critical for building familiarity, building that connection. And so with this, one of the tips you can do is like, once you kind of decide where your tone and you know, where you want this to go, you can create, you know, a style guide for reference. If you're building a team, it can be a good asset to have just for yourself. So you can reference, be like, am I sticking to the rules I created for myself? Am I, you know, not what's not the opposite of hearing? Am I straying from those rules? You know, and it's a good gut check, but it also can be something where it's like, if you start expanding the team, you can say, hey, like, this is our style guide. This is how we talk about things. And it can be a good way to benchmark yourself. Before I ask Francis, Francis is a master at this, so can't wait to give him most of the time to talk on this. Just want to call out the chat. You guys are the best. You guys did what you were supposed to do, and I love you for it. So with that recognition, Francis, what can you share with us?
Yeah. I mean, number one, I think it's about like setting that intentional plan at the beginning, like you were saying, or like we were talking about with the like ICP, right? Like when I started doing Creator Spotlight, I knew I wanted to make it pretty journalistic and like have like some kind of like, you know, standing off and not inserting myself into it too much. But also I think it's like appropriate for a newsletter like that, where it's just me writing in. It's like interviews I'm doing. We also have a podcast, right? To put myself in a little bit. So that was kind of how I put it at the start. Like I shouldn't like, this isn't about me. It's about other people, but it's also like acknowledge that it's from my perspective. So that's kind of what guides me there. But I think another really important thing is like, don't overthink it at first. Like, you know, if you're like starting a publication with like a multiple writers, you should definitely have a style guide to start from the very beginning, right? But like with something like Creator Spotlight, it was like, okay, I need to experiment and like see how people respond, see what makes sense. So I think it's good to like have some flexibility and then maybe codify it like once you get there. I think too, like in terms of like determining your tone and your voice, I think it's good to research from like a bunch of different places. Like don't just look at what other people are doing in your niche or industry. In fact, like as a rule, look outside of it too. You kind of always want to make a cocktail of like what people like, what are the norms in this industry? How can I disrupt them a little bit? How can I like make this like something fresh and unique? Because there are in most niches, right? Like so many people already producing content. And so I think it's really important to look outside. But yeah, that's kind of how I think about it is like try to be unique and like mix different things together, plan it, but also like have some flexibility so you can kind of meet your audience where they're at as they respond.
Yeah, those are great. Those are great points. And one of the things that reminds me of, we didn't cover this today because we kind of didn't include like the laying the groundwork slide like we normally do. But that's something we do cover typically in that section of like knowing your niche or like niching down, which is very important. You know, it can be that very valuable in terms of writing. It's critical when you're doing a newsletter, but knowing that niche and really kind of getting very, very specific, it's related to that knowing your audience. But
Hmm.
it's different in that like you can know who you want to write to, but you can also know that like they're also inundated by five other publications that are trying to give them news. And so kind of defining a niche within that audience that you're talking to can be very, very helpful. You know, I use the example when I go over this. It's like my girlfriend is pescatarian, dairy free, and gluten free, and it's a very, very specific way of eating that is very restrictive. But like when she meets, or when we meet people that also follow that, it's like, you know, there's this instant connection. And you know, it sounds so niche, but if you wrote a newsletter kind of catering, you know, to that specific group of people, you would immediately have so much context of like how to communicate with them, what to write about. And when they see that very, very specific niche, they're going to get so excited because, you know, there's such a pain point there that it's going to resonate way more than if you're like, hey, we're going to create a newsletter for healthy eating, you know, or
Hmm.
a foodie newsletter broadly. You know, compare that foodie newsletter versus like this very, very, you know, niche thing. You're going to have a much bigger response to that much more niche thing, and you're going to attract that audience very, very,
One thing I
you know,
want to drop in here
effectively.
too that I just thought
Yeah.
of is I think for newsletters too, it's like to developing your consistent voice and tone. It's also a visual thing. Newsletters are a visual medium, right? So it's like the colors you're using, the fonts you're using, the sizes you're using, whether or not you have like long paragraphs, a short paragraph, like one line sentences, whatever, right? Like I think that's also something that is really important to, you know, your voice and tone is like how the stuff actually looks.
Well, that's fortunate for us because I think, well, it's not the next one. It's the next
It's
one after
coming.
that, but it's coming. We're going to give you plenty of time to jam on that. Perfect. So we have our, uh, you know, we have the consistent voice and tone, we have the audience, we have kind of the groundwork covered. And so the next step we want to talk about is like, okay, we're getting to the point where we're starting to actually put pen to paper. And, you know, this is very much a callback to when we talk about, you know, what are those emotions and what is the end that you have in mind. And when we talk about this, we're talking about headlines and hooks. Originally, it was headlines, but I figured a hook was a little bit more of an effective thing in the newsletter world. But basically, you know, this is going to be arguably the most important part of whatever you're writing in terms of either newsletter or writing for yourself, you know, for an essay or whatever. And this may not be necessarily the very first thing that you finish. In that, you know, if you're coming up with these different, you know, emotional connections, the takeaways, CTAs, and whatnot, you may kind of have an idea of where you want to go, but you may not want to kind of crystallize that hook until the very end. But it can be very helpful to know kind of where you are going to start with. And when we talk about a hook or a headline, we're talking about that initial either statement or beginning of your writing that is going to really compel the reader to want to continue reading. There's a practice of thinking through this of like, when you start writing, your goal should be like each sentence by sentence, creating this journey that's going to want to, you know, beg a question and compel the reader to continue down the rabbit hole with you. And so, you know, whether that's a headline in the inbox or whether it's like the hook to begin the opening of a newsletter or the beginning of an essay, you know, mastering that very, very beginning part is crucial. Now, when I say mastering the beginning part, it doesn't necessarily have to be the first thing that you do. This can be something you write, and I know a lot of people do this. They will write the entire thing, and then they will come back with the entire body of work written, and then they'll craft their hook. But in terms of like, you know, the order of kind of impact and kind of the hierarchy of like impact, this is kind of at the very, very top, because if somebody's not compelled to continue reading after your first sentence, then you haven't done, you know, it doesn't matter how much you've written below, they're not going to continue. So, you know, whether it's a headline for an article, whether it's a, you know, email that you're writing, whether it's an essay that you're writing, clear, concise, attention grabbing, you know, beginnings are critically important. A lot of times these use what we call power words to evoke emotion and curiosity. So you're going to use, make a big statement or make a big claim that doesn't seem realistic, and people are going to be like, I don't believe that. Like, what, this can't be true. I need to figure out like more about what, the claim that's being made, or, big numbers. It's like, can you believe that, 170 million thousand people will vote today, whatever it is. A/B testing different headlines. So if you are running a newsletter or any kind of like email based program, or even web programs, I think too can do this. You can A/B test different headlines, so you can see, okay, does like very does using power words and like a very bold statement hook people and get them to open, or does it leaving it open, like a very short concise question, leave it open? That's something that Tyler loves to do with his newsletters, like ask questions that are like kind of shocking or off base. It's like, I don't have an example off the top of my head. He would have one if he was here, but short versus long, questions versus power statements. These are all things you can test to really figure out what resonates with your audience. And then specifically to emails, you can really optimize. You can leverage that preview text. This is something that goes a little bit under the radar, which is why I included it. But like using that preview text, so it's like if you're asking a question in the headline, a lot of times users will see kind of that preview text right below, and it's a great opportunity to kind of continue to build the anticipation, or to continue to set up whatever that hook is, so that they really are compelled to open the email and continue reading. When we talk about the preview text, that would kind of be similar to like the subtitle. So if you have a headline that's like very compelling, and then you have a little bit of help or subtitle text, that subtitle can be in service to the headline to just continue to build that anticipation and get them into the actual body of writing. And then you get into your first sentence and you go from there. This is such a big topic, which is why it's like done from such a very high level in this slide. But Francis, can you give us a little bit of insight into your process when you're going through
Yeah.
this process?
So I mean, obviously we're always competing with like anything else you can look at on your phone or on your computer, like whether it's, something you're reading, something you're watching, whatever. So I think it's like good to be aware that it is always a competition. I like when I'm selecting people to interview for Creator Spotlight, like I spend maybe up to an hour pre-researching a person, trying to determine like what do I think the hook is gonna, maybe I haven't even spoken to them yet, but it's like what do I think the hook is going to be? You should like be thinking about that from the beginning, because if there's no hook, why are you going to spend hours working on it, right? So then like I go into I design my questions around that to try to get answers that'll get to the hook, and then when I'm writing it and like writing the headlines and stuff, I'm like, okay, I think like these are 2 or 3 hooks that could work really well, and I'll this is just like on the story level, not necessarily like the sentence to sentence level, but it's like I'm gonna try to like start there when I write the thing and design it all around that. I think one thing I do too that I sometimes I need to remind myself to do is like move paragraphs around. Like sometimes like just even doing that can make a thing hookier, where it's like you're doing too much, you're trying to introduce the idea too much. You're spending too much time on like exposure when you really should just get right into it. I think it's good to like trust your readers in that way. But yeah, then like for A/B testing headlines, subject lines, I'm kind of like, okay, these are like 3 things. Like maybe I think people will be really interested that this person made this much money and like got this many subscribers in 1 year, or I think like they're going to be really interested that like they can produce this many videos in this little amount of time. And then like that's always informing like the next thing I'm going to write too. Like, okay, people were really interested in this type of hook. Now I'm going to look, when I'm booking interviews for the next month of Creator Spotlights, I'm going to look for people where I think I can build this hook into it. So I think that's really important, is like that A/B testing in emails is so great because it can teach you that. But yeah, one last thing I'll say is like be opinionated, which goes back to like something Tyler said to me once, that like it's not clickbait if you deliver on it, right? Which you got you can have like a controversial headline for the newsletter, but then just deliver on it, explain it somehow in the intro or whatever. But yeah, I think it's good to be opinion. Worst case, you're wrong, and it's fine to be wrong as long as like that people might engage with you more, and then you can learn from that and just be opinionated.
Makes sense. That's such useful advice. I love that. Cool. We will move along. Next slide, and this is something that we were foreshadowing a little bit, talking about writing devices and different ways to structure your writing. Foreshadowing, I remember from like 5th grade, you learned about that, right? So, structuring for readability. So, this is something that Francis kind of previewed a little bit, but once you start writing, you're getting pen to paper. You are, you've got a couple paragraphs down. What can you do with the little structure, not necessarily the words or the prose, but with the actual structure to enhance connection with your readers and make it more effective? It doesn't really matter if you have, I mean, maybe I guess if you had the best prose in the world ever that the world's ever seen, you could just do it in a big block of text and people might read it. That might be the power of just like, great prose. Or if you're, what's the guy who wrote Ulysses? It's just stream of consciousness. Examples where the exception proves the rule. But structuring for readability is one of the critical parts of writing something that's going to be compelling and that's going to be digestible, going to be easy for users to kind of interpret and comprehend. So just some quick, these are very, very tactical pieces of advice. I'm going to steal some that Francis has provided earlier, but basically the varying lengths of paragraphs and sentences for not just easy scanning, but also easy consumption. When you start to read paragraphs that, maybe have just a couple words and then they kind of expand and contract, and then maybe you put, a super long sentence in there at some point, you start to kind of get this flow that ebbs and flows. It's kind of like music where you get into a groove. Francis is smiling because I stole that from him word for word. Took the words out of his mouth. But there's tools out there that can help you do this. So like there's Hemingway app that will actually show you kind of the length of your sentences and basically will say, hey, you have too many long sentences, you have too many short sentences. But this, is a very effective approach. A lot of times you see people on like LinkedIn famously will really abuse this, where it's like they just put every line is like its own sentence, which is a little crazy and a little bit much. But when you're writing, having those varying levels sentences and paragraphs, in terms of length, really helps to add really texture to your writing and makes it way more engaging, all things else considered. With Beehive, if you're writing a newsletter, we provide incredible support for a lot of different formats. So you can do like headers, block quotes in a couple different styles. You can use lists, dotted lists, or ordered lists, unordered lists, bold, italics. Obviously you don't want to abuse any of these things individually too much, but all of these elements have different ways of impacting the display and the format that the reader is presented with, and really make a huge difference. The goal is to basically allow for that kind of digestion as they read through your content. You need to have somewhat like lulls as users are reading, so they can really digest, maybe the concept that might be a little bit tougher to digest that they just read. So it's like if you're introducing something that's a topic or an idea that's a big idea or maybe a little bit nuanced, you can present it and then give the users a little bit of break, whether it's visual white space where they're going to have a second to kind of regroup, or whether it's some sort of transitional language, or maybe you include some links or a widget of some sort. Having some of that space to allow users to not just feel like this, so that they don't feel like they're kind of climbing a mountain as they're going through your content and just being hit with heavy idea after heavy idea that's causing them to do a lot of mental lifting. Using kind of a logical flow from beginning to end is super helpful. And one of the things that I personally have used, there's a book called The Pyramid Principle by Barbara Minto. It's a very, I guess, famous book. It's been around for quite a while, but it wasn't introduced to me until like relatively recently. But it's basically this woman who was a consultant at one of the big consulting firms like BCG or McKinsey, and she had a skill for making these very complicated topics that included a lot of detail very, very concise and digestible. And what she recognized was that a lot of people, when they write or when they talk, they do it in a way that is not logical, and it's therefore not necessarily easy to follow. And so if I'm explaining to you an idea, a lot of people naturally will explain a lot of like the bullet points of like, or the reasons why they believe something. And then they will lead to say, and because of that, now, you should be led to this conclusion, which then has this impact. And so what happens when you kind of start from the bottom up of presenting all of that evidence first and then leading to kind of your idea, is that user or people who you're either writing to or listening to have a hard time of structuring or placing that data. They may kind of have an idea of like what that data that you're giving them is supposed to mean, but it can be hard for them to place it within the right context if you're starting from the bottom up and the bottom and then working up versus starting from an idea and working down. And what she found was the best, most clear thinkers and writers started with this pyramid principle where you start with kind of a situation. Maybe it's like, here's like the status quo, and then here's a challenge, and then here is basically the thesis of like what we should do, what you should think, what you should, whatever, kind of the call to action. And then from there, then, it becomes the unpacking of the ideas, so that as you unpack those ideas, the user or the reader already is thinking about those concepts in the context that you presented to them. So they kind of have this idea of, okay, cool, here's where we are, here's where we're going, this is what we need to do, or whatever kind of that situation is. And then when you actually explain to them those details, they can connect them to that central idea. Otherwise, you're presenting ideas that are disconnected. They have no tethering or grounding. And then by the time you introduce them all, they're kind of all floating out in the air. People are making their own connections, and then you're tying them all together. But when you're kind of leaving people to their own devices to kind of make these connections, it's distracting. It's creates mental energy. It takes mental energy to keep all of those things floating around. And so by kind of introducing more logical structure, it's one of the best things you can do to make your writing more clear and concise and structured. Francis, we've never talked about that topic. It's something that I found to be really, really incredibly helpful. So this is the first time maybe you're hearing about it. Maybe it's not the first time you're hearing about it, but it's the first time you're hearing me talk about it. What are your thoughts? Would love to.
No, I think it's a really good thing. Going back to what we were talking about hooks on the previous slide too, right? Where it's like you can make a claim, right? Like a start like with the pyramid principle. Start with like a bold claim, like here's this thing, and then that kind of like piques the curiosity of the reader. Like, okay, how are you going to prove this out? And that keeps them reading. And then you kind of get to the end, you get to the point, you get down there, and you can do that on like a whole essay or article structure. You can do that on a paragraph structure. You can do that on like a sentence by sentence structure. But yeah, I think like the big thing for me here is the texture. I'll tie it back to kind of the first bullet point here is, you've heard me say this before, is like, I'll die on the hill that like people should not be writing these like LinkedIn one sentence, one line things. 'Cause that's, to me, like I see that and I know what they're doing. I know that it's just like kind of this engagement bait type of thing. I'm not even just going to read it. I'm not even going to see the content because I know the intention behind it already. Which is just to say, like, I think format should follow the content, right? Like it's okay for a dense research paper to have these long paragraphs because like, again, your audience is going to expect that and know that. And on social media, it is okay to sometimes have like these shorter things because your audience is going to expect that and want that. And I think this also goes back to like following the logical flow from introduction to conclusions. Like you want to like guide readers, but not in this like when it's just one line, it's like literally like just a ladder that you simply climb down very quickly and you kind of miss out on it. But when it is like varied lengths of sentences and paragraphs, you're like providing the opportunity for the reader to like digest it. And so I think that's kind of ties in both the first and the third bullet point here is like you want to give the reader the opportunity to digest. And like I'll bring it back to climbing a mountain, but like you said, but in a good way where it's like, maybe there's a bit of like a hard climb and then there's a resting point, right? And that's just like one simple sentence. Like you got to give this variance. That's how people read things and understand it.
Absolutely. Couldn't say it better myself. Perfect. So we're getting kind of towards the back end of the presentation. So we've structured our content, our ideas, our foundation. And so now we're getting more into like the style and how do we create compelling content and, stylistically structure our narratives so that they connect with users. And the way that we do that is through storytelling. Storytelling has existed since the dawn of time. Pretty confident to say that, since languages exist, we've been sitting around the campfire telling stories, creating myths, creating legends. There's a reason why they have such strong staying power and why they're so inspirational. And so, taking that concept of, telling a story and engaging through storytelling is one of the like, just S tier, like, surefire ways to drive that engagement and connection with your reader. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. Obviously, this isn't exhaustive, and We're not going to get into kind of, kind of some of the deeper stuff, but there's plenty of books out there about structuring narrative. So there's like different narratives like the hero's journey and stuff like that you can get into that are kind of studied in classic arcs that you can take. But kind of on a very, very simple level, using anecdotes and personal experiences connect are generally going to be way more effective than just presenting facts and kind of the synopsis of an overview. So if you think about, if you're trying to tell the story of, there was a situation, something happened, the person took an action, and then there was a result. If I just say, Francis started Creator Spot, we wanted a way to interview creators. Francis created Creator Spotlight. He wrote a bunch of articles and then built his following. Like that's not really that compelling. But if I really kind of get into the nitty gritty and really tell that story of like his passion, or if he was to tell that story from a first person view, you could have that same narrative of like situation, problem, action, result, which is kind of a general setup, but telling it from his perspective of like what the conditions were in a much more rich way in his own words, versus my words of just kind of giving the overview are going to be way more impactful. And he does this all the time with the writers that he writes about. So I won't get too deep into it. I would love to hear kind of how you take that approach with the creators you write about, because having read Creator Spotlight, like you're kind of a perfect example of like this personal experiences and anecdotes to connect. You're constantly telling the stories of like very richly of like the problems that were faced and like how users face them, and kind of going and really personalizing them. As you're telling these stories, again, this kind of calls back to Creator Spotlight, but when you're able to incorporate kind of success metrics or evidence of success, or impact, or it doesn't have to be success. It's success if you're trying to convey something that is like has a good outcome. But if you can convey some sort of metric or quantitative measure or story about something that caused sadness, for example, you're gonna have a much bigger impact than just making a statement that this person was sad. If you can kind of go a little bit deeper than that. I would say, as you're doing this, kind of, we talk about climbing that mountain and taking breaks. If you're trying to write like an emotional tour de force, you're going to want to give people those opportunities to kind of take those breaks. And so interspacing, within the newsletter content with kind of take breaks where you can ask for feedback, or do a poll or something, or introduce kind of a different type of element can help break that up and kind of give the users the opportunity to digest. But then kind of, as I kind of started with the last thing first, I wasn't following the bullet points, but kind of, studying and understanding story arcs and traditional story structure can be really, really helpful in maintaining like that clean narrative arc to keep users invested, so that you're not making, mistakes that people have made in the past and learn from. If you really study that art of storytelling, you can get to a place where you're creating compelling stories. I want to give most of the time here to Francis, because he is a master at this.
Oh, thank you, EJ. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the whole premise of Creator Spotlight, is like I want to like tell stories about creators and extract insights, lessons from what they've done for readers to take away and use on their own. But like I don't like reading just like a cleaned up list of like, here's how you do the things. I like reading the stories, so that's why I write them like this. But I think a great example of this is a recent issue I did about this guy Alex Emery, who's a YouTube strategist. And I was like, okay, this will be an interesting story to like give advice on like behind the scenes approach to like not being a creator but being a strategist who helps creators. So my the first line, the hook, is when you reach 1 million subscribers on YouTube, the company sends you a golden plaque to mark the occasion. Alex Emery has 2. Neither one bears his name. And so I'm setting it all up, right? I'm like, you're going to learn like how he got to 1 million subscribers on YouTube twice. And you're like, oh, like neither one bears his name. Like, okay, like how is he doing this behind the scenes? And I think this opens the loop that then I close by the end of it, where I explain these 2 things. But then going through too, right? I'm like, there's parts that are more narrative, and I'm like telling a bit of his story, and then I'll get into more like, okay, here's how he approached working with this YouTuber, and like how he approaches like coming up with ideas for production, etc. And then another one, the one that I published on Friday with Ramil Sheikh, the name of the newsletter is Terrible Content Works, and so that won the A/B test, by the way, against some that had numbers and stuff. But then the start is a quote where he's talking about how his family are all entrepreneurs, and he got a job, and they're like, "You're wasting your time. Please quit your job." And then there's a lot of good stuff in here about like how he approaches his content, how he grew, the way he approached organic growth versus paid, how he's approached building businesses around the newsletter. But like that's all in there. But my belief is that like it's gonna keep people more interested if we're like telling the story around it, and this is all couched within it, and it's like they're all intertwined. Like I'm not giving you just the separate like here's who this guy is, here's what he did, and then like here is exactly what he did that you can take away. Which I have that at the end, the little like steal this tactic section. But I'm a big believer in eating my food. I don't drink Soylent, right? I want to chew on the thing, and I want to think about it, and I think I'll take more from it, from the experience by going through it like that.
That's a classic Francis one too. I wish I had thought of that one to sound
Francisisms.
super smart. Yeah, Francisisms. The reason why I have you here on these calls is so I can like absorb your Francisisms and then like cause you to have to come up with more because I steal them.
I love to do it.
Iron sharpens iron. Cool. All right. Moving to the last slide is one that I'm probably just going to let Francis almost take the entire thing because this is something that he's a master at. But basically, once you've got your story out, you've gotten your content out, you've gone through this entire journey, you're sitting in front of your screen, you have a draft ready to go, and you might think, great, I'm ready to hit send. But wait, you're going to want to hold that and not do that right away. The last step truly is to go through and really edit ruthlessly for clarity and impact. So it may sound obvious, but you'd be shocked at how many people don't necessarily go back and edit after their initial draft. They may write it. They may, unfortunately, have AI write it, and then they just like put whatever it is and drop it on the page. There's all these situations where you just have this initial draft and it's not gone through and edited. There's a bunch of different ways. I mentioned Hemingway app is a good way to it will very, very ruthlessly like recommend things to you remove. It kind of gets infuriating when you're like, I don't know how to take more words out of the sentence, and sometimes that means you have to change the structure entirely. But removing unnecessary words, repetitive phrases, anything that's going to make your writing sound repetitive or redundant. One great thing is to read your content aloud to catch awkward phrasing, something that may not sound natural, the way you wrote it. Another thing that's very popular is to, you can, what's called read backwards. Like depending, it's like if you're writing 3,000 words, it's tough. But if you like read your writing backwards, it's like a hack to catch like misspellings because your brain's not necessarily going to kind of view the word as like a clump in that way. And then lastly, just send it to somebody before you do it. If you're with Beehive, you can send that draft link. You can send a test email. There's a bunch of different ways you can get your content to people without having to press send. But with that kind of in mind, Francis, what's your process?
Yeah, I got a few things to say. One, I will say again, time is your friend. I always try to write a newsletter over like 3 days so I can like write the first draft one day, the next day come back and edit a lot, and then the third day it's basically edited, but like just look for a few more things. I will say again, reading out loud is really important. Every time I write a newsletter, I'll read the whole thing out loud before I schedule it to go out. I think that other people are your friends. If you have like a friend who will edit for you, like that's hugely important. But that's not always the case. I don't necessarily have somebody who has the time to edit Curtis Spotlight all the time. So this is actually the one way I do use AI. I don't use generative AI to write. Again, I like the writing. I like chewing on it. It's writing is thinking. But I will. So limitations are your friend here. So I want the newsletter to always be below 2,000 words. I've been trying to get it even lower. So let's say for last week's issue with Ramil Sheikh, I had 1,800 words, and I wanted to get it down to like 1,300. And so I put it into Claude. I've started using Claude over ChatGPT, and I was like, hey, this is this long. Here's the audience I'm writing it for. I want to get it down to I want to lose 300 to 500 words. Can you give me some suggestions on what to cut and like what's redundant? And it did. And so it got me down so I went through and I applied most of those suggestions and I got it down by like 200 words. I didn't want to take all the suggestions. So then I, went back in. I was like, hey, like I got it down this far. I want to lose another couple hundred words. Here's some suggestions you gave me last time that weren't really good that I, think about something else. And then I went back in and I did it again. So having that word count limitation in your mind where it's like you should always write longer than it in the first draft, because then that gives you material to edit when you cut down. That's a big part of how I write. Um, but yeah, the most important things are just like having time and having another person. Whether that's you a day later, which is what time gives you, right? Is just like gives you that separation from the thing. Or yeah, this is the one thing that I'm like I really think AI is super good at helping with. And then also, yeah, I'll just reiterate, read it out loud. I read the whole newsletter out loud to myself at least once. You'll find errors that you wouldn't have thought of, that AI wouldn't have thought of, etc. But yeah, it's simple. It's just about time, having those limitations, those rules, and ideally having another person or
Amazing.
AI.
That's great sage insight. Um, we are coming up on the very end, so we're going to answer. Let's take 3 questions from the Q&A. We will have Tony relay them to us, and we'll repeat them for the chat, and then we will wrap up with those 3 questions. Yeah, so the question was, how do we think about A/B testing as a framework around content specifically? So I assume this is like talking outside of like subject lines and stuff like that. Francis, what do you do when we're thinking about, and we've been on all these strategy sessions together about Creator Spotlight. We don't necessarily strictly like send 2 versions of the same
Hmm.
content out to 2 different groups, but when you are optimizing content, what has your process generally been?
Yeah. Well, it's like I think the things I've A/B tested before are like length, order of sections. A good way to track that, right, is clicks. Creator Spotlight isn't really a clicks forward newsletter, but I'll like, maybe I'll put in a special poll where I'm like asking some question. I think too, sometimes you don't want to ask. Sometimes you want to ask the specific question like, "Hey, I changed the order of things today. Do you like it?" Like maybe people won't answer that, maybe they will, but it's also good to do it to like just put a poll that's like in a specific place where you're just trying to see if people scrolled down that far and engaged. So the poll doesn't have to be about that at all. Like, do you see this? It should be like something that is kind of provocative and gets people to want to engage. And then you'll see how many people clicked it. And then you try it again next week and see how many people click that. If you put it in a different place, see if they're scrolling that far down, whatever. Yeah, I don't know. A/B testing, it's good. Do it. I'm much to my the chagrin of my sanity, I'm never fully satisfied. So like, I'm always testing things.
There we go. What do we got next, Tony? Thank you so much. So the question is, how does AI fit into workflows, our workflows, the writing workflow, and how we use it? I think Francis touched on that a bit with the editing. So maybe we don't go too deep into that. I think that, um, one thing that I've done personally with generative AI, after reading Pyramid Principles, I built like a custom GPT to help me outline and like create, kind of structure my thinking around it, which is maybe in some ways kind of counterproductive to like the practice and what I'm supposed to be teaching myself through writing in the Pyramid Principle. But I created a GPT that was basically like, hey, I want to write about this. This is the impact I want to have. This is the hook. This is the emotion, kind of all of those foundational items. And I want to write a piece using the Pyramid Principle, and this is the topic that I want to write about. Can you suggest basically that outline? And then from there, I can take that outline and write from it. And it kind of takes away a lot of the mental energy and friction of getting started, which as an
Mhm.
early beginner writer is like one of the biggest challenges for me. I don't do a ton of writing. But I think that process would probably be very, very different for Francis. And I think, as you said, you use it primarily for revisions.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would add there?
No, I mean, as a rule, I don't like use anything directly written by AI, but yeah, I just use it as like I don't have time or a person to like, I know this thing will be made better by somebody editing and somebody getting eyes on it, but I don't have time, I don't have the resources to like make that happen. So it's like it's just another pair of eyes where it's like let me get a little bit of perspective, and then that'll just advance. That's just something for me to think against. But yeah, I think it's good to put human made stuff out in the world. AI is good at getting you from zero to like, here's the page isn't blank anymore. But I think it shouldn't be overly relied on. But it's a good like it can make parts of the process go faster.
Love that. Tony, one last one. We got 30 seconds and then we'll do our closing. We'll go maybe a minute over to catch up for the minute we started late. Yeah, so I mean, I'll let Francis like answer most of it. I'd say if the length of it, if you're getting clipped, obviously that's a technical limitation. If you're, worried about engagement, I think Francis outlined a couple ways you can gauge engagement. Like, does it need to be that long, or is it just like long because that's how much you're writing? Is there opportunity to edit and cut it down, to make it more impactful but not lose any of the meaning? I think some of it's like, if you're writing and it's meant to be long because you're writing like a story, like a narrative, that obviously would be a different scenario. Maybe an approach like it would be a framework, Francis, that you could maybe come up with on the fly and share of like how you can assess whether your length is too much enough, technically too long, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, a few things. I think one, there's no hard and fast rule. It depends who you're writing for and what the subject is. I think it is better to be a little shorter. Be mindful of your reader's time, right? I also know like I write these 2,000 word long newsletters and I can read them in like 5 minutes, but I know some people might take 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So it's like be wary that other people's experience of it is going to be different than yours. I think one thing I've tested before is having like the full version on the website and then like clipping the main story to like only 300 words and seeing how many people click through. But then, sometimes people don't click through and you're like, well, maybe more people will actually still read it if it's just EJ, showing you Slack. If
Yeah.
people are in the with people reading it in the newsletter. So I think there's no hard and fast rule. It's just you got to like even just talk to your readers. Make a segment. If you're on Beehive, you can make a segment, see who's opening every single one, see who's opening only half of them, and just email them, being like, hey, how many of these do you actually read in full? I think it really matters, the subject matter and your specific audience. So you just got to go out there and study it. But I think as a general rule, I keep it at 2,000. I've gone up to like 2,500 before, and I was like, this wasn't wise. Yeah, and again, this is where I do sometimes use AI to find places to cut down the length.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I'm sure that was super helpful. I do want to answer Cynthia's quick question, the functionality around reading more on the web. The way you would do this is if you had a longer piece that you knew had to be longer, you could actually publish that piece only to web, and then it would just live as a web post, like a blog post on your archive. And then what you would do is when you write that email, you would do whatever intro, the summary, whatever kind of setup that you want to do, and then you would just have a link that would say, "Hey, click here to read more," and it would take them to that web post. And so generally, if you publish to web, you publish your full newsletter to web and email. Every message is going to have like the read online button at the top, but it's not going to say like read more on the web. That would be something where you would like make that deliberate decision to publish and then direct users there, which can be very effective. Cool. The last thing we will say, we always plug the community. If this was helpful today, and you like this, then the community, the Beehive Hive community might be the place for you. The Hive is a members-only community for our paying customers. We have more than 3,000 active Beehive customers that are posting every day. I'd venture to say hundreds of messages a day across all kinds of topics: how to, product requests, tear down my newsletter, how can I make it better? Give me feedback. Do you want to do cross recommendations? There's like 10, 12 different channels that are all kinds of conversations are happening through all times a day. You can always get a question answered super quickly and engage with other people who are just like you on the journey, launching and building newsletters. So want to do that. And now just to say thank you. Thank you to you who have stuck around. I can see that we're losing some folks with the live count, but if you've stuck around, even if you didn't stick around, if you stayed here for any time, we appreciate it. But I want to give a special thank you to Francis for taking time out of his busy day to spend time with us, for Tony for being the world's greatest producer in the background, and to all of you reading on the screen, so that you're really what makes the magic happen. You make it worthwhile. You literally, by being here, make it so that we're just not talking to thin air, which is the most magical thing and great for our mental health. So thank you. We value you so much, and we look forward to connecting with you more deeply in the comments online. Feel free to reach out if you guys need any help. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.
Thanks, y'all.
Cool. We're good. We're no longer live.